May the words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be now and always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. This morning, we need to talk about deferred consequences. Because there's this thread that runs through so many of the readings today, this idea that humanity keeps coming back to. This hope, this false hope, that we do indeed live in a just world, where bad things only happen to bad people, and where righteousness is consistently rewarded with blessing. Where you can tell who has sinned because they are suffering, and you can tell who is righteous because they have been blessed with great wealth and fortune. And the thing is, we know that we do not live in a world like that. But there is something in us that persists, that keeps telling us that we should. The world should be like that. But that's not the world we live in. That's not reality. On the one hand, though, both scripture and common sense tell us that the way to live in the world with more goodness in it is to live with goodness and with righteousness. And then there you are, goodness adjacent. And it's true. There are ways to live in this world that bless it and make it better, and those ways are worth pursuing. But it is also true that we are deeply and profoundly interconnected, and that we can use that interconnectedness to lift one another up, to help one another, to heal one another, to make a home for one another. But it is also true that we can choose, because for some reason God is passionately committed to our free will, we can choose to hurt one another. It is entirely possible, as connected and interconnected as we all are, to disconnect that chain of cause and effect. And to make sure that if I am the cause and I get some benefit from my causing an action, then I can do everything in my power to make sure that the effect impacts someone else. On my cynical days, I suspect that the economy is just the word we use to describe how we divvy up causes and effects, and who gets to reap the benefits and who gets to pay the price of choices they did not make. But still, we want to hold on to the hope of a just world, where bad things only happen to bad people. So we recognize this maybe when, after worshipers in the very act of worship have been rounded up and killed. I looked at what I wrote 3 years ago. It was right after an act of violence committed in a place of worship. And then I wrote this last night, which was right after an act of violence committed in a place of worship. So worshipers in Jesus' time, in the very act of worship, have been victims of an act of violence, and their blood mingled with the blood of their sacrifices, a whole group of them, pilgrims from Galilee. And so the crowd has run to the most prominent Galilean they can find in the area to ask him what they think about it, to get a soundbite. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Whose sin caused this, Jesus? What did they do to deserve it? Or perhaps with a hint of accusation, you've been stirring the pot, Jesus. Don't you think maybe Pilate went after those Galileans because of you? And we recognize this, I think. I recognize this desire to make it clear how those people are not like us. Those people made choices that we would never make. Those people brought their misfortunes upon themselves. I recognize this desire to deny our interconnectedness with those who suffer, because I need to know that it could not happen to me. It could only ever happen to those people. And in answer to their questions, Jesus says, "You will perish just like they did," which could be interpreted to mean, yes, you are right, God does work just like that. And if you don't watch yourself, God's gonna get you too. But, ew. Or it could be interpreted to mean, you are just like them. And they were just like you. Stop trying to draw the lines between the kinds of people that this could happen to and the kinds of people that I am. Because they're the same people. The world is random and hard. And sometimes towers, like the one in Siloam, sometimes towers collapse. And if you are standing under it at the time, it isn't because you deserved it. It's because we all live in a world where landowners cut corners and they cheap out on building materials. And there is gravity. Which is hard if you are looking for comfort and order in a just world. But it's also true. But after this, after you are just like them and they were just like you, Jesus says, let me tell you a story. Now, let me tell you something I had to learn from the internet, but that I like to think Jesus and his audience of laborers and farm workers probably already knew. And that is that a fig tree can mature in 3 years, or it can take 4, or it can take 5. And that if a fig tree is going to take longer than 3 years to bear figs, that's just the nature of the tree. No amount of amending the soil is going to speed that up. Fig trees just grow as fast as they grow. And a thing that I believe that those of you who garden do know, and that I've picked up from sometimes listening to Ed Lawrence when I turn on the car radio, that would also be familiar to Jesus' audience, is that sometimes the reason that a flowering or fruit-bearing plant doesn't bear fruit or flowers is because it is getting too much fertilizer. Somebody nod, somebody who gardens. Thank you, okay. Because flowers and fruit are a survival mechanism, but they take up a lot of energy. So if there's no challenge to threaten a plant's survival, they don't do that. They just keep growing more stem, more root, more leaf. So this is actually Jesus being quite hilarious. Here's this landowner who literally doesn't know the first thing about how to grow a fig tree, who thinks he's in charge of how to grow a fig tree. And then his gardener says, just give it more time, and I will do the one thing that will have exactly the opposite effect to what you want. And the gardener knows so little about trees that sounds just fine to him, and off he goes. If you recognize your boss in this story of someone coming in and telling you what they want and how to do your job without having any clue how to actually do your job, rest assured that Jesus' first listeners also recognized their boss in this story. We can be pretty quick in some of these stories to assume that if they are God stories, that God is the king, the landowner, the boss, the sovereign, right? But nobody who had worked the land, nobody who had labored for a landowner like this one, this man who feels entitled to the fruit but has no idea how to actually tend a tree, none of Jesus' first listeners could hear it this way. If there is a God figure in this story, then all the wisdom is found in the gardener, who is the one who knows how to handle both a late blooming tree and a demanding landowner. And he is the one who would remind us that things will unfold as they unfold, and that too much is lost if we are too quick to the axe. If we decide that any tree is just a waste of soil, we are cutting our own selves down because we are deeply interconnected. And in this interconnected web, the true measure of power and authority is often the extent to which we can disconnect ourselves from the consequences of our actions. And I don't just mean that the folks who can afford the best lawyers get away with more, although that is also true. But who was the worst sinner? The contractor who used inferior tower building materials, or the public official who lined his pockets with the funds earmarked for Siloam infrastructure repairs? It doesn't matter, because neither of them were among the 18 found in the rubble. True power in this world is the power to look away, the power to ignore anyone else's suffering, because after all, the world is fair. So if bad things are happening to them, it must be because they deserved it. And combine this with the often misquoted words we hear from Paul this morning about how God is faithful and will not let you be tested beyond your strength. Hands up if at any point in the last 2 years you have been tested beyond your strength. As if it was God's choice to do this thing and not Pilate's. As if we don't live constantly in a world of deflected consequences, where over and over and over again, people are pushed beyond their strength by the consequences of choices they did not make. As if the ones who declare wars are the ones who are going to fight and die in them. As if the ones who make environmental policy are the ones whose sea-level villages will be washed away. As if. And there is so much temptation to deny the reality of our interconnectedness, to deny the reality of how much of our misfortune is just random, dumb, stupid, bad luck of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. There is so much temptation to deny that every single person who suffers is just like me. And I am just like them. We are all living with the consequences of choices, some of which we made and many of which we didn't. And rather than respond to the suffering of the world with compassion, rather than respond to our own selves when we are pushed beyond our strength with compassion. It is so easy and it is so very destructive to try and draw the lines and to blame an individual's sorrows or suffering on their own bad decisions, on their own sins. But Jesus will have none of that. Do you really think? Jesus often answers a question with a question, and I think that might be my favorite of his questions, the most pointed. Do you really think? It isn't really the tree that's being given a second chance in this parable. It's that self-righteous landowner. He has been given a whole year to realize that the fig tree is already offering beauty and shade, and it's sheltering birds, and it's feeding insects, and it's participating in the delicate ecosystem of the vineyard. That it is not, and it never has been, it never could be wasting the soil. And aren't we all? Participating in the delicate ecosystems of this world, where we were planted in places not of our choosing. Connected and interconnected. And we have this incredible power through our interconnectedness to hurt one another. But that is not the only power we have. We are all connected, and in our connectedness, we have incredible power to heal and to help and to hope and to make a home. But we cannot do it if we are busy separating ourselves and our choices from those people who've had bad things happen to them. Because we are just like them. And they are just like us. And we are in this together. Thanks be to God.